Освободи злоти.
Well, hello you lovely people, a long time no see. I hope you're all doing well. For those of you interested, I briefly mentioned why I've been gone for so long at the end of this video. First things first, I'm running an Arma 3 giveaway on Gleam. I've got 6 keys in total, so if you don't own the game or you've got a friend who would like to play with you, then definitely try your luck. Details down in the description. So, helicopters. I almost fell out of my chair when I first saw this on Twitter. They're currently on the experimental branch of Reforger, and they're probably going to come to the official branch within the next month, I would say. They consist of 2 helicopters. So we've got an Mi-8 for Op4 and the trusty Bell Huey for Blue 4. I've been blown away by the sheer level of detail and love that went into these whirlybirds. In this video, I'll firstly be covering what the new features are compared to Arma 3, and then I'll wrap up by talking about my future wishes, thoughts and speculations. Firstly, damage model. It is honestly something I think you might all agree that we've had on our Arma 4 wish list since the very beginning. That modular destruction model like you see in games like Grand Theft Auto and DCS. Honestly, I thought it would never make it in, but here we have a working damage model that doesn't just cause the helicopter to instantly implode upon the slightest collision. Well, just imagine having this in multiplayer and the emergent gameplay opportunities for search and rescue after a crash landing, instead of just, oh well, boom, you're dead, respawn, see you at base. The fact the rotor can break off in this way is just amazing to me, and the damage model is actually quite deep. So if you strike your fuel tank in the rear, or you do a particularly high speed crash, you'll go boom instantly, kind of like an Arma 3. But if you just hit the rotors, you can probably survive, as you can see here. Now, it actually interacts really well with the medical system. So if you cause severe damage to your own player, as well as the aircraft, like a head-on collision, you'll usually just go unconscious, as shown by this black vignette or blood splatter effect. And the helicopter will carry on flying, and it could bank suddenly backwards like you can see in this clip. You can shoot different parts of the components on the helicopter to yield different damage states, but we kind of already had that in Arma 3. However, here, I would say it's much more pronounced. Take this as an example. If you shoot the fuel tank, it will not only cause, of course, fuel to leak, but it also has a chance of causing the helicopter to catch fire before eventually exploding. We definitely didn't have this in Arma 3. You can also do rocking out, as you could in Arma 3, to recover from a broken tail rotor. And what's really nice is individual bullet holes are simulated on the helicopter model instead of a generic damage state skin. It looks so much better, and you can see precisely where on the airframe you took fire from. And again, think about gameplay. If you were doing a reconnaissance mission, you could almost determine which side the enemy might be on from looking at the side where the bullets hit. If you crash land the Mi-8, an onboard Russian cockpit voice will say this.
Низкое давление масла в главной коробке приводов.
And this roughly translates to low oil pressure in main drive box, low oil pressure in right or left engine on emergency power. Credits to NadeXD on Reddit for this translation. In Arma 3, the damage model was kind of all or nothing. Although the tail and main rotor could be shot off and even removed, once you crashed, that was that. But here, the remaining parts of the helicopter will stay operational. If you collide with the main rotor, the tail will keep on spinning. And yes, it can kill you. More on that later. If the engine is damaged, your helicopter will still start up, but it won't take off. It will just kind of limp around, and smoke will bellow out of the exhaust pipes. It's really nice, and it adds this feeling that helicopters are delicate and easy to shoot down, as they are in real life, obviously with some caveats depending on the type of aircraft, bullet caliber and range. In terms of explosions, they are, well, very explosive. They actually feel meaty, and they even make your character flinch. The physics of the helicopter also reacts to them, as opposed to in Arma 3 where they would either just slide along the ground like Bambi on ice, or they would just stay fixed in place. 2. UI and cockpit interface. So you'll probably see from this that there's kind of a DayZ-esque interaction system going on here, kind of akin to the modded helicopters in DayZ. I think it's nice. It's nice to be able to look at different parts of the cockpit to control things, and especially the lighting system, which I'll touch on later. The UI for different damage states, it's just really nice and clean. It doesn't take up too much screen real estate, and it gives you the relevant information you need to know. So in Arma 3, it kind of gave you all of the damage states, but you just need to know basically what's broken. And so I think this is a really nice clean approach to it. Unfortunately, the large gauges in third person can't yet be toggled on and off. You can also move around the interior seats like in other Reforger vehicles, and there are loads of lighting options. So you've got collision lights, navigation lights, the main kind of spotlight for search and rescue. You've got cockpit lights, which are called dome lights. Just again, imagine for gameplay, right? You've got a night operation and you need to turn off the interior cockpit lights for that extra element of stealth. I just think this is such an interesting thing to have for different types of gameplay. 3. Animations. The swash plate, which is the mechanical device, that kind of weird arm thing that moves the main rotor heads up and down and around, it actually interacts and is fully and independently animated for each blade. With every control input from the cyclic, it moves the rotors individually, and depending on which cyclic movement I use. I don't know why I love this so much, but it just really made me feel connected to the airframe, and I honestly appreciated the devs for taking the time to animate this level of detail. It just looks awesome, and it even applies to the tail rotor, and as you can see, the wheels on the Mi-8. The skids and wheel suspension actually bounce and flex under the pressure of a landing, which is just amazing to see. It's so believable, and again is a far cry from the Arma 3 days where helicopters felt like these rigid 3D models that had no personality to them. I was a bit skeptical about the bounciness of the Mi-8 suspension, but after using it for a little while, I've grown to like it. It makes me feel like I need to be more intentional with my landings. I can't just slam it down and be done with it like in Arma 3. Speaking again about the main rotor, since it's actually animated, instead of a generic spinning disc skin slapped over the top of the 3D model, it can be collided with, of course, as we've already seen, but it can also collide with objects, such as players. The result? Bodies actually ragdoll away from the helicopter blades if they are struck, like in GTA 4. I call it the human blender. In terms of the cockpit animations, there are of course lovely animations for entering, exiting and changing seats of both helicopters, but the true star of the show is that the pedals, cyclic and collective all move in harmony. Really awesome to see everything moving all at once, and it just adds to that connected feeling. 4. Environmental effects. So depending on the area you've landed on, the downwash from the blades will vary. If you're in an area with heavy foliage, loads of leaves will be kicked up in front of the cockpit. But if you're on a sandy beach, you'll just see dust flowing around. This modular attention to detail is something that we just never saw in Arma 3. Also, instead of that generic smoke effect when you're hovering over water, it actually looks like it's being swirled around by your rotors, and it reminds me of this Arma 3 concept art. Finally, there is this really nice effect on the Mi-8 where you can see a flicker of flames each time you start the helicopter's gas turbine engines. It's supposed to mimic a combustion engine startup, and well, it looks very good. 5. Flight model. I've gone through some comments so far, and the prevailing theme from those I've spoken to and consulted is that it kind of has a DCS feel to it. If you haven't played DCS, basically it's much less arcadey than Arma 3 with a more weighty feeling to helicopter flight. And I think weight is a good word to use when we're talking about this flight model. Each helicopter feels like a huge hunk of metal spinning through the air. It feels like there's this kind of inertia, and when you drop off a cliff edge like I do here, you can see the tremendous amount of momentum I gain. It's not like in Arma 3 where, yes, you gain speed, but the helicopter is basically just this kind of floating brick which goes up and down regardless. The controls almost have this delay to them, but not in a bad way. It's just to mimic that feeling of weight. In terms of landings, because really that's my bread and butter, I can do probably 80% of the landings I could do in Arma 3, give or take. So bleed flares, spiral LZs, J hooks, they're generally okay. But because of a combination of the flight controls, the weight of the helicopters, like I mentioned before, and this animated main rotor, I've definitely had to, let's say, adapt my flying. I think the benchmark for flying hasn't necessarily been made more advanced than it was in Arma 3, so you're still going to see great pilots, but there will be fewer ridiculous landings like you see from the best of the best King of the Hill pilots, and I don't think that's necessarily a bad thing. In Reforger, the helicopters are very hungry for your input. Unlike in real life, if you take your foot off of the pedals or your hand off of the cyclic, it will literally fight you until it's crashed somewhere. Helicopters are in constant tension with the air. They don't want to be up there and they don't want to fly. And so in Reforger, you have this constant tension that you're battling to, where you need to be using tiny control adjustments to keep airborne. The engines on maximum throttle feel strained when you're trying to climb a large incline. And like the real Mi-8, which is renowned for having a low climb time, you gain and lose altitude extremely quickly, but it's less floaty than in Arma 3. You get a sense of the weight and responsibility of the helicopter and how you have to treat it with a great deal of respect, especially with this new animated main rotor. It is a totally different way of flying from Arma 3, but in a positive direction, I think. Personally, I think you could get away with far too much in Arma 3's flight model. At times, yeah, it was unforgiving, but the really good pilots of today in Arma 3 have, to be honest, pushed it beyond stupid limits. We also have wheeled landings and, of course, wheeled brakes. So both of these were, of course, reserved to advanced flight model pilots in Arma 3, but now it's available in the standard flight model. 6. Sounds. Each individual part of the helicopter has its own sound layer. So the tail makes its own sound, then the main rotor, the auxiliary power unit or the APU, the skids, the wheel suspension. It's all separate but feeding into a bigger overall orchestra, if you like. Now, as well as contributing to this connected feeling I spoke about earlier, it also means that when you crash a helicopter, parts of it will carry on working. So listen to this, you can hear the APU is still ticking over. And then of course the sound of the tail rotor, but the main rotor sound is gone. There's a very clear difference between when you're flying slowly and when you're really pushing the helicopter to its absolute limits and reaching top speeds. It sounds like the airframe is genuinely under tension. finally, what is my speculation and my wishes for the future of Arma Reforged's helicopters? Firstly, controls. Whilst I could mirror my old Arma 3 controls with a bit of faffing around in the menus, and it is certainly better than the first iteration of Reforger, it definitely needs to be on par with Arma 3's system, where you could drag across keybinds from a pre-selected list of inputs, and you can't, for example, add double tap keybinds. Another issue with controls was TrackIR support. Whilst it works in Reforger, it is very janky and very sensitive. It's probably the most useful peripheral for Arma pilots. It'd be nice to see more cockpit interaction for things like radio, possibly even to cut the fuel line to prevent a fire if you're crash landed. There's so many different possibilities that they could do here, but I say that with a caveat that the flight model needs to remain about as it is now. It needs to be easy to pick up, but hard to master. We don't need complicated things like Vortex ring state, except maybe if they ever add an advanced flight model. It's basically striking a balance between fun and realism. The Mi-8 appears to rotate to the right or left when it's landed. I'm not sure if this is intentional or not though. Rolling back in the Mi-8, even with the wheel brakes on, as you can see here, is just too severe. It makes hills, even the slightest incline, feel like an ice rink. It needs a feeling almost of wheels sinking into mud and locking into place on terrain. There's no picture-in-picture in the cockpit mirrors yet. We need a way to rescue unconscious players inside the helicopter. I think it would really complement the medical gameplay nicely. In future, there could be the possibility of cargo logistics, so adding physical crates to vehicles. And we could also see refueling helicopters from the outside with hoses or some kind of interface other than simply parking near to the aircraft. It would bring in a deeper level of logistics gameplay. We need auto rotation. Currently, it's, as you can see, just not working. The co-pilot function is apparently coming soon. So there's a possibility of doing things like controlling the searchlight and taking controls. Perhaps seeing something like a moving map or a GPS in the cockpit would be helpful. But I'm not sure if this is a bit too advanced given the time frame of the game. Having a gunner and armed variants of these helicopters would be great. This is on the roadmap, so it's 90% confirmed as coming in the future. When you crash in the water, you kind of just sink to the bottom, but we of course know that isn't what happens in real life. The helicopter is filled with air, and so usually it will roll to the left or right, or the helicopter might even have something called sponsons, which is where it has a flotation device which may allow it, in an emergency landing, to stay floating to allow the crew to evacuate. It would be nice to see advanced taxiing when you landed. So currently you can do rolling landings, but you cannot do rolling takeoffs. In terms of damage model, perhaps seeing the tail boom actually snapping off entirely, but this, I understand, could be too much of a headache to make possible. Now, the damage model on that subject, it really does need a bit of tweaking for enemy fire. In my testing, the helicopter caught on fire almost instantly from a few HMG rounds from the Humvee, and I really mean a few. Now, whilst the helicopter isn't, of course, meant to be a bullet sponge, I expected just a little bit more resilience, especially for the sake of multiplayer. I mean, imagine how unusable helicopters would be in something like King of the Hill. Another feature that I've been asked about is walkable interiors like we have in DayZ, but that may be pushing it a little bit. But are there any more? Some of the Bohemia team may be watching this video, so definitely comment your suggestions down below. I'm mindful though that the devs have already been hard at work with what they've produced so far, and in my opinion, they've really done a great job. I am absolutely loving the helicopters. They are a joy to use, and I haven't been playing Reforger this much for a very long time. Anyway, good luck in the giveaway, guys, and as a small update about where I've been, I've been studying at university again to get my postgraduate training to become a lawyer. It was a very, very stressful year, but I've got a bit of a break now before I begin my actual training in practice. So thank you for sticking by me. If you're listening to the end of this video, you know who you are. I really do appreciate you taking the time. I only do this as a hobby, so thank you again for making it worthwhile. Hope you have a great rest of the week, and I'll see you in the next one. Tommy out.